So we're now recording for those who couldn't be here. So welcome everyone to this class on the Haggadah in depth. I'm really excited to be teaching it because it's been a year in the making, because I was intending to teach this course last year in person. And I think it's one of the first things that we had to cancel was, I think, my first class last year, right after Purim, which was really one of our last big events that we had in person. And I was all prepared to teach this class, to get ready for Passover, and then, of course, the pandemic. And I wasn't yet ready to do classes on Zoom yet. That would probably be another month or so before we all became experts with Zoom. So rather than jump online, we just canceled the class, which was unfortunate. So it's taken a year, but here we are to talk about the Haggadah. And I'm so glad you could all join us. So I think it's going to be a good class. And I was kind of thinking, I had the Rabbinical Assembly Convention this last week, which was really a very interesting program. And it was all virtual, all online, nobody in person, which is new for us. And we always have great professors. And I've sort of discovered a professor who I never had. He teaches actually at Brandeis, and I never learned from him, but I had taken a session that he was teaching at the last Rabbinical Assembly Convention that I was at in person. And so this year I signed up specifically because I wanted to hear him, because he's really fascinating. And he's a professor of Jewish liturgy, so Jewish prayers is his main area of study and focus. And he was teaching a class on the Shema, so not germane to the content to this course, but he said something that was really interesting. He said that his main function, and the professor's name is Reuven Kimmelman, and he said, his main function is to take something that's very familiar and defamiliarize it. And when you think about it, liturgy is the thing that we are most familiar with. We pray 3 times a day as Jews, and our Shabbat prayers are every week. So we say the liturgy over and over and over again. And he said, familiarity is the biggest obstacle to understanding our liturgy, because we say it over and over and over again. And we eventually, we kind of lose the meaning because of the repetition. It's kind of a little counterintuitive, but I think he's right. You would think, well, repetition, you would learn it really well. Well, we learn it really well to recite, but we don't necessarily think about what we're reciting. We don't think about we sort of pass over things that may have been obvious if we were to look at them in depth, but because we just do them by rote, we kind of lose the interesting aspects of the text that we pray. And I thought this is very appropriate for the Haggadah. It's not quite as familiar perhaps as the Siddur, but it's pretty familiar. It's probably the one Jewish book that is the most read by Jews all over the world. And we do it every year. So depending on how old you are, you've recited the Haggadah many, many, many times. And there probably are things that you've read every year, and you think you know it in one way, but maybe you haven't actually plumbed the full depths of the text. So that's kind of my project with this class, is for us to maybe defamiliarize ourselves with the Haggadah so that we can get some more deeper meaning from the text that we recite all the time, once a year, every year. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. And my kind of goal is to really look at the Haggadah from a historical perspective and a structural perspective. So, of course, the Haggadah is also the Jewish book that's been printed the most times, I'm sure. There are the most editions of any Jewish book. I mean, you've got the comic book Haggadah, you've got the, the I don't even know, there's a Haggadah for everything. So there are all kinds of ways of approaching the Haggadah, but for me specifically, I want to approach it from a historical perspective. So looking at the development, how did this work come to be that we have in our hands? And also from a structural perspective. So why do we do the 4 questions, and why do we do them where we do them? Why don't we do them at another point in the Haggadah? Why do we talk about the 4 sons where they are and not some other place? So what is the kind of overall structure? How does it lead to the goals of the Seder and Passover? So I've got a couple of Haggadahs here. That kind of do what I'm speaking about here, is look at it from a historical perspective. So a really great Haggadah is the Shakhtar Haggadah. See here. So this is created by the Shakhtar Institute in Israel, in Jerusalem, where I studied for a year during rabbinical school. And it's great. It's got the full text of the Haggadah, but it also has beautiful pictures which come from manuscripts of Haggadahs from the Middle Ages. So it's really visually very beautiful, and also some pictures from more modern Haggadahs as well. And then in the back, there is commentary on different sections of the Haggadah. So it's not really Haggadah meant to be used at a Seder. It's very big and thick. Wouldn't be the most convenient one to use. And then I have here a Haggadah, which is a classic. It's actually all in Hebrew, but it's a Haggadah by Daniel Goldschmidt, and it's the Haggadah and sources and its history. So it's all in Hebrew, but it really goes in depth as to what's the history of the text. So it's a classic edition, but also again not one that one would use really at a Seder. Then this one though is in English, called the Passover Haggadah, but it's edited by Nahum Glatzer, and it if you look at it, it's actually has commentary based on this Haggadah, by Goldschmidt. So it's sort of an English, not a translation. It's really summaries of what Goldschmidt does. And so you see you have the text and then commentary below. And this one actually you could use at a Seder because it's small, light, paperback, and it has some essays in the front. So it's a nice one. And then there's this book, which is not a Haggadah, but it's called The Origins of the Seder. And so this is just a book of history which recalls, looks at how the Seder that we know came to be, how the ritual of Passover, which originally was slaughtering a goat or a sheep, how did that become a meal where we all talk for 3 hours and sing? It's not necessarily that one would easily lead to the other. So he tries to answer the question, how do we get to the Seder that we have today? And then the last book, which I don't have down here, it's actually upstairs, so I won't be able to show you the physical book, but I'm going to show you a page from it, is a really interesting one called the Polychrome Haggadah. And the way this Haggadah is structured is, it is the text of the Haggadah, but it has, the print is in different colors. I'll show you in a second. And the idea is that the Haggadah is a composite text. It wasn't that somebody sat down and decided, I'm going to write a Haggadah, and started from the beginning and went to the end. The Haggadah is a text that is layered. Different pieces were added, one by one, until we have the Haggadah that we have today. And of course, different communities of Judaism have different Haggadahs. So a Sephardic Haggadah is going to be a little bit different from a Ashkenazic. The Maxwell House that Erwin is holding up, it's going to be different from others. And so we should first point out that not everybody is going to have the same exact text of the Haggadah. And we should also acknowledge that if you went back in time, the Haggadah is going to look different because certain pieces hadn't yet been added to it yet. So it's a composite text that's made up of lots of different pieces. And the Polychrome Haggadah is great because it shows you that in a very visual way. So let me share the screen here so you can see. And I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. Can everybody see?
Oh, but I get closer.
So this is actually the bookmark from the Polychrome Haggadah. But it's also, this is printed in the book itself. You see the different colors. So the different text, if it's in black ink, it's from the biblical time period. If it's in red ink, it's from the Tannaitic period, which is the time of the Mishnah. And if it's in orange, it's the Aramaic period, which is the time of the Gemara or the Talmud. Green here is the Gaonic period, which is the period right after the Talmud was written. Those were called the Gaonim, the rabbis of that time. Then the Middle Ages is in this brown, and modern times, or we might call that modern, but it's 1500 to 1899, and then contemporary, which we would might call modern, is in blue here. And then every time there's a square, it tells you when that text was introduced into the Haggadah. So, there's a difference here. So something might have been written in the Bible, it might be in the Bible, and it's in the Haggadah, but it didn't get into the Haggadah in biblical times. So it may have been the rabbis of the Tannaitic period, of the red time period, who brought that text from the Bible into the Haggadah. So when there's a block, a colored block, it'll tell you when did this enter into the Haggadah, when did this text. And then it has broken lines and thin lines here, which refer to individual passages, which may or may not be in the original Haggadah. It may have been a later edition. And then he has little notes as well. So it's a really ingenious idea here. It was created by this man named Jacob Friedman, who I think unfortunately passed away rather young, and he produced the Polychrome Haggadah, and he was trying to produce a Polychrome Siddur as well, to do the same thing with the Siddur with these different colors. And I think he passed away before it could go to publication, and apparently his manuscript has been lost, and so we don't have his Polychrome Siddur. And then the Polychrome Haggadah actually went out of print, but somebody revived it, was able to, I guess, get permission from his estate, his family, and you can actually go on Amazon now and they print it on demand for you. So my copy actually was printed in February of 2020, which is just amazing the way that printing goes today. And so you can purchase it, and they'll print it for you and send it to you, which is kind of neat. So here is a page from the Polychrome Haggadah, and you might recognize this as Halachma Anya, which is the beginning of the Haggadah. He calls it preprandial because he likes peas. So he has like preprandial, prandial, postprandial, and postlude or something. So this is, before the meal, pre-prandial. And he tells you that the Magid, which is the idea of telling the story, he puts that in black, which is biblical. And so in his opinion, the commandment to tell the story is a biblical commandment, and he has a lot to support him in that. And you see he refers to Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. And so that's why he says this was introduced in the biblical period, even though, of course, there was no Haggadah in the biblical period. And then Halach Ma'anya was not only written in the Gaonic time, that's why it's in green here, but it was also introduced into the Haggadah in the Gaonic period. But then there are some additions to it as well here that you can see. So the text that we have had things added in either, I think this is the medieval period, and this, I think, is actually from an earlier period, but was inserted in here. And then, of course, you have the 4 questions, which, as everybody knows, well, maybe not everybody, but is one of the most popular sections of the Haggadah. And you see here, it's in red. So it was introduced in the Mishnaic period, the Tannaitic period, which is before 200 CE. But if you notice here, not all of the 4 questions are in the same color. And we're going to get to this in a second. But 4 of the questions, the introduction and the first 3 questions are in red. They are those were questions in the Mishnah, which we'll see in a second. And then there's an additional 4th question that was added later in the Gaonic period. And you see it's also underlined to say it was added later. And we'll get to that in a second. But I wanted to give you a sense of how this book works and how it's kind of cool that you can kind of see the seams and the composite nature, the composition of the Haggadah in this book. Any questions? Any thoughts? Also, I don't know that the Polychrome Haggadah is the best Haggadah as well for a Seder meal, because it's really designed for study. It's not necessarily designed to be used.
It's da 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 da. Is that the part that you start to sing in the beginning? Is that same thing that you're talking about?
Well, I didn't.
I can't sing it. Ha da 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 da.
Oh, Halach Ma'anya. You're right.
Yeah, is that the
Halach Ma'anya. That's one of the tunes. I think there are lots of different tunes that you could do, but
I'm saying that's from this.
Yeah, I mean, you'll find Halach Ma'anya in every Haggadah.
Right.
This tells you that it mostly is from the post-Talmudic period, the immediate post-Talmudic time frame. But yes, that's the Halach Ma'anya, the Achlu Avatana. So I wanted to talk about the 4 questions in a little bit of depth. And the 4 questions probably is one of the classic examples of a text that's familiar, and the familiarity hinders us perhaps in our understanding of what's going on. So would somebody like to read here the 4 questions?
As the youngest, I could read it.
Oh, sure. Well, it's a very interesting question of whether or not the youngest is supposed to read it or not. But
oh no,
go ahead.
Okay, so Pesach Haggadah, Magid.
You can even read this part too if you want.
Perfect. He removes a plate from the table. We pour a second cup of wine. The son then asks, "What differentiates this night from all other nights? On all other nights, we eat hametz."
Hametz.
Yeah, I'm so close. And matzah. This night only matzah.
Yeah, I didn't translate this, so their spelling of matzah, whoever translated, is a little different. But go ahead.
On all other nights, we eat other vegetables. Tonight only maror. On all other nights, we don't dip our food even one time. Tonight, we dip it twice. On all other nights, we eat either sitting or reclining. Tonight, we all recline.
Okay. So this is a text you're probably mostly familiar with. How many of you do this? Remove the plate from the table before the 4 questions. Does anybody do that?
It would be the
Which
Seder
plate are-
plate, right? Or any plate you're eating off of. I mean,
The Seder plate, not your. You don't remove people's plates. Erwin, were you saying? Do you do this?
No, I don't.
Yeah, we don't really do it either. Does anybody do it? So we'll get to it in a second. But does anybody have a thought? Why would you remove the Seder plate before the 4 questions? Does anybody have a thought? Well, it relates to the question I want to ask, which is, well, actually, let's move on to the source for the 4 questions, or some kind of questions, I should say. So would somebody like to read here? This is from the Mishnah, Psachim. So this is the section of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first code of Jewish law, which was written or edited around 200 CE. It was the first code of rabbinic Jewish law. This section is all about Passover, and specifically this section is about the night of the Seder. Would somebody like to read it?
I can read it, Rabbi.
The attendants brought vegetables before the leader of the Seder prior to the meal, if there were no vegetables on the table. He dips the hazaret into the water or vinegar to taste some food before he reaches the dessert of the bread. For example, the bitter herbs, which were eaten after the matzah. They brought before him matzah and hazaret and haroset and at least 2 cooked dishes in honor of the festival. I can't read.
Tana.
Tama comments that this was the practice, although eating haroset is not a mitzvah, but merely a custom. Rabbi Eliezer ben Zadok says, actually, it is a mitzvah to eat haroset. And in the period when the temple stood and they offered the paschal lamb, they brought before him the body of the paschal lamb.
Okay, keep going here just a little bit here.
Okay.
Number
The
4.
attendants poured the second cup for the leader of the Seder, and here the son asked his father the questions about the difference between Passover night and a regular night. And if the son does not have the intelligence to ask questions on his own, his father teaches him the questions. The Mishnah lists the questions. Where are we?
Here you go. Sorry, I'm moving it up for you.
Okay, why is this night different from all other nights? As on all other nights, we eat leavened bread and matzah as preferred. On this night, all our bread is matzah. As on all the other nights, we eat other vegetables. On this night, we eat bitter herbs. The Mishnah continues its list of the questions. When the temple was standing, one would ask, as on all other nights, we eat either roasted, stewed, or cooked meat. But on this night, all the meat is the roasted meat of the paschal lamb. The final question was asked, even after the destruction of the temple. As on all other nights, we dip twice, and according to the intelligence and the ability of the son, his father teaches him about the Exodus. When teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory. And he expounds from the passage, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, Deuteronomy 26:5. The declaration one recites when presenting his first fruits at the temple until he concludes, explaining the entire section.
Thank you, Florence. Wonderful reading. I gave you a lot there. So this is the description in the Mishnah of the Seder night. So I have this question here. What's odd about the placement of the four questions in our Seder in contrast to the Mishnah? So if you look here in the Mishnah, the sequence is, they bring vegetables in front of him. They dip hazeret. Hazeret is lettuce in water or vinegar or something like that. They bring him matzah. They eat the matzah and chazeret. That's that lettuce. Charoset, which we of course know, this ground up nuts and fruits, and then two cooked dishes. Then they have this debate about whether charoset is a mitzvah or it's just a custom. And then they bring the Paschal lamb. They actually would eat lamb on the night of the Passover. Then they pour the second cup, and then they ask the questions. So what's different in that sequence?
In our Seders, the children ask the questions first before anything's done. So they must have had some experience already.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. So we do not eat the meal first. Here, it seems like they ate the meal and then they ask the questions. We do it the opposite. We ask the questions first, and then we eat the meal, like, depending on how long your Seder goes, it could be, half an hour later or an hour later. I mean, depends on, how much you got, do at your Seder. But it's not even that we don't eat we ask the questions first and then we go right to eat a meal. I mean, there's a lot more to do before we even get to the meal. So this is an example, at least for me, where when I kind of was studying this, I thought, wait, I've done this for my whole life, and I never kind of thought about it, that it does, I think that the four questions actually don't make sense the way we have them. Yeah, Aaron.
So one question I have is that why are they the four questions? I see one question and four explanations.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that too. Many have noted that they are not really questions, and they're certainly not questions of information. So in Hebrew, they're not really called the arba she'elot, which is a standard question we're asking for information. They're the arba kushiot, the four difficulties. So they're presented as like contrasts, but they're not really questions that we might say that we might ask. So we'll get to that. That's an important question as well. Lynn.
Is that because it's Americanized that why do we ask the four questions when we have four questions, and so they've simplified it for America? Or is this universally done, like in Israel and Europe and every place else?
That we think of them
four
as
questions.
Well, everybody asks the four questions. I mean, it's been asked. You saw up here.
But I mean, before the Seder, in the beginning of the Seder, and then we call it the four questions, or is that a modern terminology?
Well, calling them the four questions, that's interesting. I don't know what like Israelis call them. You see here, it's called manishtana. That's another way of, say the manishtana, right? That we say.
Right.
So that's another way of presenting it, not necessarily as questions. But has anyone ever, have any of you noticed this oddity that the questions make much more sense if you've already had the meal, right? If the point of the four questions is that the children are pointing out things that are odd about the meal, then it makes sense that they've seen the meal and they're pointing out these questions. It doesn't really fit if it's before the meal, because how would a child see that they've eaten matzah? How would they have seen that they've eaten the maror? It sort of doesn't make sense. If it's really like meant to be a child asking his or her parent, then it makes sense in this drama framework as happening after the meal, the way the Mishnah presents it. Yeah, Brenda.
Yeah, I was going to say though, I was always taught that the children start the Seder, and that's to keep them interested. And obviously, like I said, they must have had a Seder before to be able to ask those questions. But I was always told that, they're gonna get tired if they're really young. They're not going to sit through a meal and then do the whole Seder. So I was always taught, well, you get the kids involved right away, then they have to listen for the answer. But I don't know.
Yeah, no, that you're absolutely correct. That is essentially been the case. And actually, if you go down here, an answer to this question, of the odd placement here, it comes from this book here, the Passover Haggadah by Glotzer, Nahum Glotzer. So we don't really know why the order changed. So we know that it changed at some point. That it used to be in time of the Mishnah, at the very least, you would have the meal, and then you would start what we think of as the Magid section, the telling of the story, and that flipped at some point to be telling the story first, then eating afterward. But no one knows exactly when that happened. It seems like it already happened in the time of the Talmud. And the reason why we know that, or why we assume that, is because of this custom here, which a lot of us don't really do, which is to remove the plate from the table. So they understood that it was a bit odd that we would expect the children to ask before the meals even happen. So this removing of the plate is actually something that was done in the time of the Talmud, although in the Talmud, it's not the plate that was taken, it was the whole table that was taken away, because they ate more like a TV dinner style, like everybody had their own plate, their own table, like TV dinner tables. And so they would take the table away, and that would prompt the kids to ask these questions like, what are you doing? You just put the table down and now you're taking it away. Why is this night different from all the other nights? So it seems like in the time of the Talmud, they already had this flipping of the sequence. But there is no source that tells us why they did that specifically. Yeah, Erwin.
I think in a way, at least in our time, having the questions before the meal, in a sense, is like having an order to the Seder. There's an agenda of the things you do. By asking the questions first, obviously for the youngest children who may not know this, it's a learning experience. But by asking the questions and having the responses, it's a prelude to what you're going to be doing in the meal. And you know what your obligations are. And the Seder becomes not just reading from the book of the Haggadah, but the eating in the meal itself is a physical fulfillment of the Seder also. So you're discussing what it is you're going to be doing for this occasion.
Right. Yeah, and the rabbis seem to have been very keen on beginning with a question. They didn't have to begin that way, and specifically of the children to ask it. They could have begun with just a sermon, like the father, because it's the traditional text, the father would expound on the Passover Seder or the Passover story. That's one possibility that you could have given as the structure, but they said no, it's got to start with a question. And even they say, even if it's just a performance of a question, it may not actually be a question that somebody is spontaneously asking that would begin it. It can be just a we're just going through the motions of the question is still important for them. Yeah, Brenda.
Yeah, well, really, you're telling the story to the next generation. And you want them to understand that they are part of that story, even though they're the next generation. We've all heard it many times as adults, maybe, but the next generation has to hear it, and you educate them. So they're the ones that are asking the questions. They start the Seder, and of course they end it when they find the Afikomen too, maybe. And I think it's passing it on to the next generation.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Isn't the Seder plate really the symbolic meal?
Yes,
It has
well, it's definitely a
everything on it.
symbolic. You don't really eat it.
No, but it has the lamb or the lamb shank and everything of part of the meal that they're questioning. So it's right in front of them.
Right.
The 4 questions.
Right, and it may be that I haven't researched this, that the Seder plate that we have, there may be that the reason why it's there is because of the flipping of the meal and the telling. So you look at the Mishnah here that Florence has read. There's no indication of a Seder plate. They just bring them literally the chazeret, the lettuce, and they bring them the charoset. It doesn't say that they put it all on one plate. It just says, they serve it and you eat it. And that prompts the questions. But if you are having the questions first before the meal, you need something to prompt it. And exactly, Phyllis, what you're saying, it's presented there for the children. You can see all of the things that they're going to ask about, the maror and the shank bone and and then of course the matzah is already on the table too. It's not usually on the Seder plate, but these things are there. And then when you take it away, it's meant to prompt the question because they haven't eaten the meal yet. And the children is also probably, perhaps is the reason why the Seder was inverted. So would somebody like to read here this piece from Nachum Glatzer? It says in the course of centuries.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Elaine.
What is odd about the placement of the 4 questions in our Seders in contrast to the Seder of the Mishnah? In the course of the centuries, the ritual of the Seder has undergone only one decisive change. The questions and the Haggadah recital were advanced to a position before the meal. The reason for this change, which already makes its appearance in the Talmud, was probably a fear lest the recital of the Haggadah suffer after the meal and the drinking of the wine. This change, however, caused the loss of direct immediate relation between the questions and the ritual of the meal.
Thank you. So Glatzer, what does he think is the reason why the order changed?
Be drunk afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean,
Hey.
You're not prepared to have a really good discussion when you're sated, when you're satisfied. Either you've had too much wine or too much to eat too. You could be, you've had your fill, and you're not going to be prepared to have a really good discussion. And also the question of the children, which Brenda mentioned. The kids are going to be done once the meal is over. They're falling asleep, and we all probably either have stories that that happened to us or to our children of the kids drinking the wine and they're falling asleep, and the Seder goes forever and the kids are just out. So if you have the meal first, then it's not necessarily going to work in terms of doing what Brenda mentioned, which is to pass on the tradition from one generation to the next. And so this was a change that was probably necessitated by the reality that they wanted the Seder to work for children, and it probably wasn't. Now, and so they made the change, but it does create our own challenges today, which is the challenge of, hey, I'm hungry. When do we eat? When do we eat? When do we eat? Right? And so people are constantly, hankering for the food and ignoring the important part of the magi, the telling of the story. So we in our family try to solve this dilemma by having extended hors d'oeuvres during the Magid portion. So we don't serve the actual meal, but we do kind of what the Mishnah says here, which is you have some dishes, you have the chazeret and the charoset. So we have all kinds of various dishes that are served. So we're hopefully, for our guests, they're not going to be completely full to where they might fall asleep during the Magid, but at least they are somewhat satisfied and hopefully not saying, when do we eat? When do we eat? When do we eat? Lynn, you don't have your hand up, do you? Or
No, that was from before, but we call it crudité.
That's right.
Crudité. And
Yeah.
it started in Israel when you were there studying, but also when Richard Tucker used to sing down here in the winter for the Seders, and all these people would pay $100 a person to go to a hotel to sit in on the Seder in order to keep their mouths shut and keep going while Richard Tucker sang. They filled the table with all kinds of, olives and pickles and all sorts of stuff. So we just carried on that tradition.
Right.
To keep our mouths shut.
Yeah.
We just give the kids some extra food. The adults can wait.
Right. Yeah. Brenda, go ahead.
Yeah, I was told by a rabbi once that when you eat the parsley, you're eating the greens, there's no reason why you can't eat a whole salad.
Exactly.
And you can have lots of greens, and the kids will, munch on carrots and greens and everything. So that keeps them going.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we do. The crudité, salad, however you want to, whatever you want to serve, that works. So I do want to also get back to the question that Aaron brought up, which is that these aren't really questions. And they're odd sort of questions. So one interpretation is actually that, of course, in the Mishnah and lots of different Haggadot, there's not necessarily a question mark here. So we read this as Manishtana halayla ze mikol haylot. What's different on this night from all other nights? But I read one comment that said you could read it as not a question, but as a declaration. So ma in Hebrew means what, but it also means sort of how. So in Hebrew you say ma yafeh hayom, how wonderful it is today. It's not a question necessarily. So it could be a declaration really. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol haylot. How different this night is from all the other nights. That's not a question, that's a declaration of wonder at how different the night is. And then the rest of these are just pointing out oddities, that on all other nights we can eat chametz and matzah. This night we can eat, we only are allowed to eat matzah. It's not necessarily a question there. There's no why here. It doesn't say lama, which is, or madua, which means why in Hebrew. It just points out some odd things. And again, it makes much more sense if the children have actually seen this happen. And this also is reflecting the fact that the four questions, if they're really questions, don't get answers. So I'm sure probably some of you have wondered, if there are four questions, where are the answers to the questions? Go ahead, Erwin.
I like to think of it as the Manishtana as a question, not necessarily a declaration. In the simplest terms, there have been Seders where we've simply said, the whole point of the Seder is Ma. Just why, and everything else is explanation and fulfills the retelling of the story.
Yeah, I like that. That Ma begins the question where we're saying, what's going on here, and that leads us into the whole Seder. An interesting story, which I didn't bring for you here, is in the Talmud. There are a couple of places where they describe Seders that they had, the rabbis, and a very smart kid asked a question, which is not one of the 4 questions. And the rabbis say, wonderful question that you asked. You now exempted us from asking the Ma Nishtana. So it doesn't, these originally were meant to be prompts. It was script, as it were, if you didn't have good questions. But if you have good questions, you don't need the Ma Nishtana. Now, back in the time of the Talmud, the Ma Nishtana, I don't think, was as beloved as it is today. Today, I think probably most Seders where you say, oh, someone asked a good question, now we don't need to do Ma Nishtana. People, they might have some parsley thrown at them, because you got to do the Ma Nishtana. And that was already back in thousands of years ago that people already made it beloved, and it was an integral part. So what started out as just talking points became a beloved tradition, and is still, of course, recited. But you see here that to Amanda's question, it's traditionally done by the youngest child, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So it could be that the father might teach him, the father might say it, or whoever's leading the Seder. And so because it's now this performance that's done, and also because originally it was meant to be something for the father to say if there weren't any other questions. So let's say you had children who just didn't have any questions, then the father would recite it. And if the father says it, then it makes more sense that it's not questions, right? So the father would be saying it in a declaratory sense, right? The father would be saying, how different this night is, guys. Let me point out to you how different it is. On all other nights we can eat bread and matzah, but on tonight we only eat matzah. So if it's the kid saying it, it makes more sense as the questions. If it's the father or parent saying it, then it makes much more sense as just these declarations of oddities. Go ahead, Amanda.
Do you know sort of which came first, this tradition of having kids say it or moving the questions to the beginning?
So wait, say the question again.
It's the idea is that the questions were moved to the beginning at some point. They used to not be there, and now they're in the beginning. But this concept of having children ask the question, or this tradition, I guess, do you know if that would predate the moving of the questions or post-date, or where does that?
I think it probably predated moving it, because so if you see here, they pour the second cup of wine, and here the son asks his father the questions, and then we have the questions. So I think probably it was the children asking it first, and then probably once that became established, then they moved it to before the meal, because they wanted to make sure that the children didn't fall asleep or get restless or leave the table.
Or parents were just too drunk to ask the questions. If waited 2 cups in.
That could be it too. Yeah. So the question of what the Ma Nishtana actually should consist of is also really interesting. So if you remember, when I was showing you the Polychrome Haggadah, you saw that the 4 questions were actually in different colors, implying that they were from different time periods. And one of the questions was even underlined because it was not in the original text. So this is really fascinating how it's evolved over the years. And you may have noticed in the Mishnah when Florence was reading that her questions were not the same kind of questions, the same 4 questions that we have. So you can actually go to the Mishnah, but the problem sometimes with looking at text of the Mishnah to find out what is the original 4 questions is that sometimes what happens with Jewish texts is that the liturgy will evolve, and then when somebody is printing an edition of the Mishnah, which is earlier, they'll go back and amend the Mishnah to make it match the way that the tradition has evolved. And so what has happened with the Mishnah on the Seder night is that the 4 questions evolve, and then then when they were printing the editions of the Mishnah, they said, wait, the questions that are asked in the Mishnah don't match what we do in our Seders. And so they changed the text of the Mishnah to reflect what the Seder is. So you have to go back to manuscripts. So I gave you here a picture of a manuscript called the Kaufman Manuscript, which is in Hungary, in Budapest. And it's from the 10th or 11th century. And it's one of the best manuscripts and earliest manuscripts of the Mishnah. So it goes back pretty far. And what's cool is that you can go online and you can read this manuscript. The digital world is amazing. These manuscripts have been digitized, and you can actually go back and read it. And if you read Hebrew, it's really easy to read. I mean, it looks like Hebrew. So here he said, you can see Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. Shebachol halelot anu matbilim afilu pa'am achat. All right, so I won't read the whole thing, but here it is, the 4 questions in this manuscript from the 10th or 11th century, which I thought is just pretty cool that you can get that. But here I have it transcribed, and I added some colors to hopefully make it very clear. So this is our Passover Haggadah that we have today. And this is the Kaufman manuscript. So you'll notice a couple things, and I'll give you I'll sort of highlight the English so you can see that actually the Kaufman manuscript only has 3 questions. So originally there were only 3 questions, not 4 questions. So that's obviously kind of interesting that we have, we think of it as the 4 questions, but actually it was originally only 3 questions. And only 2 of the questions, these that are highlighted in yellow, are ones that match our Haggadah, although they're in different order. So in the Kaufman manuscript, and I apologize here for the ordering, I think the problem is, when you have Hebrew and English, the text is like
I was told a long time that we had things in 3, and then we made things in 4 because 3 was the Trinity. So we had to be different than the Trinity, so we made everything in 4.
That's interesting. I like that. I hadn't heard that. Maybe that is a reason why the 3 questions became 4 questions.
I'd heard that too. I had heard that explanation.
That it could be, but we'll see. Maybe there might be other reasons too. So if you look, this was the original order. It was about dipping, and then about matzah, and then about eating roast meat. Our Haggadah, which is on the right side, has it reversed. We have the the first question here, which is about matzah, is the second one for the Kaufman Manuscript. And then what was normally our third question is the first one here. So these two are the same. It's the last two that are new that were added by our Haggadahs, and we don't have this one that's in red. So we added these blue, and we don't have the one that's in red. So the first thing that's actually interesting here is that the text is a little bit different. So originally the question was, on all nights we dip once, tonight we dip twice. So here it has even once, which sort of doesn't make sense. And possibly they added in a word don't dip, but that probably was a later addition. The original question probably was, on all nights we dip once, tonight we dip twice. Our question is, on all nights we don't even dip once, tonight we dip twice. And this reflects a change in the way people ate. So back in ancient times, they would dip, but they usually only dipped their vegetables for hors d'oeuvres. So you had crudité, you dip I personally love cauliflower, dipped in a nice, French onion dip. It's very tasty, and that they would do all the time. But, I think today we usually don't dip our vegetables in our meals. So the unusual thing in the time of the Mishnah was to dip twice. So they would dip for the hors d'oeuvres, that's that lettuce that's dipped either in vinegar or lettuce. And then they would dip the bitter herbs into charoset later on in the meal. And so that was the odd thing, the unusual thing. But eventually that question didn't make any sense to people. So they said, they changed it to say, on all the nights, we don't even dip once, but now we dip two times. Then the question of the matzah is the same. On all the nights we eat chametz or matzah. The night we only eat matzah. But then this third question became problematic. So it used to be that, and this makes total sense, that they would eat the roasted meat on Passover. They would eat lamb and they would roast it because it recalls the Passover sacrifice. They knew that they weren't making the Passover sacrifice anymore, but they were sort of doing it in memory of the Passover sacrifice. But it had to be, they only ate it roasted. They wouldn't eat it stewed or boiled. Eventually, we became very uncomfortable with eating something that looked like a Passover sacrifice. And so today, you'll find that people actually specifically don't eat lamb on Passover, and they don't eat it roasted. They'll eat meat cooked in some other way, in stewed or boiled. So this question made no more sense anymore. Or what, Erwin, what did you say?
We like to have lamb.
Oh, so you do eat lamb?
We do.
Okay. So you're going back to the Mishnah specifically. Do you do that on purpose?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There you go.
Old school.
You're going very old school, back to the Mishnah. So that question had to be eliminated because it no longer reflected the way that people ate. And then they added two other questions. So now, again, it could be this relationship to the Trinity, who knows? But they added a question about maror, which for the people in the Mishnah time wouldn't have made much sense. So in the Mishnah time, people would eat maror on a regular basis. I mean, it was just a type of herb, bitter herbs, and they would have eaten it. So this question of all other nights we eat all kinds of vegetables, but tonight we only eat maror, sort of wouldn't have made sense to the people in Mishnah's time. And this fourth question definitely wouldn't have made sense to the Mishnah, because eating reclining was just the way you ate. And so that was just a normal thing. So the reclining portion of the Seder was not something that would have sparked the children's questions, and neither would have the eating of the maror sparked children's questions. But later on, because our food ways changed, these suddenly were things that would have sparked the children's interest. Yeah, Erwin.
I guess I'm another one in the group who heard the explanation about with the proliferation of Christianity, adding a fourth question to differentiate from the three.
Mhm.
And remembering your polychrome, it seems that the last item added was about the reclining. And it really makes that stand out because the other three are all food related. The fourth one is about how do we sit.
Hmm.
So it is clearly an outlier. And you know, I kind of think that's a reason for, hey guys, we have to add a number 4.
Right. Yeah, because it doesn't relate to odd foods. You're right. And it's interesting that I was doing some reading, and the idea of food-related questions actually was not limited to Jewish meals. It was something that was done in a Greek symposium. So apparently this was typical, where they would have special foods that they would serve and it would spark discussion. And so that makes sense for either these questions in the Mishnah or our first three questions, but not this last one, which sort of wouldn't make sense to somebody at a symposium, because that's how they ate. They ate reclining. That's just the way they did it. And also, by the way, in the symposium, they would eat first and then they would talk afterward too. So again, similar to the Mishnah's original version of it. So I think, if we're kind of step back and so what is it about the 4 questions that we can glean here, or maybe discuss at our Seder? So I would, hope that, this could spark some topics for you to discuss at your Seders in a few weeks, is just the way that we Jews have evolved and our practices are constantly evolving to meet our needs. So sometimes we think of tradition as never changing, that we always do this, we've always done it, and this is the way it's got to be. And that clearly is not the way tradition works. Tradition has to evolve to make sense for the times in which we're trying to pass on tradition. Otherwise, it becomes forgotten. And you see that in the 4 questions, in the evolution of the way in which the Seder has been moved to flipped around, so that we talk first, then we eat, as opposed to the way it originally was. The fact that the text of the questions has changed. The fact that who asked the questions may have changed. And the point of the 4 questions may have changed. So I think, to me, this is could be a really fascinating topic at your Seders, particularly within the context of the coronavirus and the pandemic. You might want to ask the people at your Seder and say, how has Judaism been transformed by COVID? And what are ways that we may not go back to the way we used to do things? And another question could be, how do we make sure that the tradition evolves so that we're not throwing it away, but we're making it work for our needs, the way that it clearly happened with the 4 questions. And how do you strike that balance? And have people give examples, I think would be really cool to see, and especially because Passover was our first holiday done in lockdown, and we're still kind of there to kind of reflect on that year that's passed, which seems like a whole decade. How might these questions kind of evolve? Yeah, Brenda.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. A few years ago, actually, it was at our Seder. Rebecca's mother was one of our guests, and she had a whole list of questions. And periodically, when things got a little bit dull, she would pick them up and ask a question. We would go around and answer it. And this year, what I'm having my daughter, my granddaughter, and the other children do, I have a cards with a bunch of questions on them. And I'm going to tell them when it gets a little dull and you want to do something, pick a question, pick a person or several people and have them answer it. And some of it is about feelings, past Seders that you've had or future Seders, or how you feel about certain things. But questions are always a good way to get people talking and discussing. And so it's kind of interesting that we're talking about this, because we did this a few years ago, and I'm going to let the kids be in charge of the questions this year.
Yeah.
But
and of course, how you frame the question is always important, right? If you ask yes or no questions,
right,
then the conversation usually stops. You want to ask as many open-ended questions as possible. Which gives us to this point of saying these questions are odd because there's no answer to them offered in the Haggadah. Some of the modern Haggadahs have kind of questions, answers to the questions, but really, these are really there. And I think that reflects the idea of the best question is open-ended. If we just had answers to the questions immediately after the 4 questions are posed, we'd be done. The point is that the questions are supposed to be open-ended, that we're supposed to just, we're supposed to be talking about what matzah means, not that there's supposed to be an answer to what matzah means. The question is more important than the answer. Any other thoughts about the 4 questions? So I wanted to talk about the next section. It's not, well, it actually is pretty much the next section in the Haggadah, and really think about structure. So this is from the Talmud. Would anybody like to read here? This is from the Babylonian Talmud. This is edited around the 6th or 7th century in Babylonia. Would somebody like to read here? Erwin, I think you wanted to read before, but Florence beat you to it, so I'll give you the opportunity.
Sure. It was taught in the Mishnah that the father begins his answer with disgrace and concludes with glory. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the term with grace?
Disgrace.
Disgrace. Rav said that one should begin by saying, at first our forefathers were idol worshippers, before concluding with words of glory. And Shmuel said, the disgrace with which one should begin his answer is, we were slaves.
Okay, so I always find this to be really interesting. So we have the 4 questions, and then we get to framing the story. And the discussion the Talmud's having here is that they have an overall structure for how the performance should go. It should start with disgrace and end with glory. You should start low and end on a high. And to me, it's just the rabbis who really understand, a good performance. And, it's like a good Hollywood movie. It's a rags to riches story. It's starting where there's conflict, where things are bad, and ending positively. And you find this reflected in other places in rabbinic literature and in the rabbis' laws. So for example, when we're reading from the Torah, we're never allowed to end an aliyah on a down note. So if something is bad for the Israelites, for the Jews, you can't end that aliyah there. You always have to end on a positive note. And the same thing with haftarot. The haftarah always has to end on a positive note, which is not always so easy because the prophets are sometimes talk about doom and gloom a lot. And so you have to end it in a place where they're talking about something really nice. And sometimes that means actually we have to repeat the second to last verse or the third to last verse or something, just so that we can end in a positive way. So they have this framework here for our story, and I think we can think of it cinematically. But the question is, well, how do you get there? What is disgrace? What is the low point that we should start with? And so there's a debate here because it's rabbis and they always debate. It's the Talmud. So one rabbi, Rav, says that the disgrace is that our forefathers were idol worshipers. That should be the disgrace that we start with. And Shmuel, although it may not actually be Shmuel here, that's why it's in brackets, says that we should begin with the idea that we were slaves. So I find this really interesting, that how you begin the story of the Jewish people, where you begin your story, matters to the story that you're telling. And it made me think, actually, it sort of came to me today, that this is very cinematic. And there was an example of a movie just recently where this was an issue. So I don't know if people here are fans of the Godfather trilogy, but the third movie in the Godfather trilogy has been sort of universally thought of as the worst of the movies, and even like to be not a great movie. I mean, the first two, Godfather Part 1 and Part 2, are considered to be classics, one of the best movies ever made. And number 3 is just, you know, the poor third child, and you know, not good. So this is the 30th anniversary of Godfather Part 3, and Francis Coppola, who directed it for the 30th anniversary, actually re-edited the movie and changed the name. As opposed to Godfather Part 3, he calls it Godfather Coda, the death of Michael Corleone. And so he didn't shoot any new scenes. All he did was re-edit it. And I thought it was really interesting that the movie, at least in his mind, could completely change just by changing the structure. You know, you don't have to rewrite the movie. You can just move the story around, the different pieces of the story into different places, and it might tell a different story and a better story. So there's a little interview here that I wanted to share. Let me share my sound, and I'll optimize for video clip here.
Your old partners, they're unhappy. They think you abandoned them. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Hi, I'm Leonard Maltin, and I'm very pleased and honored to be sitting here with writer and director Francis Coppola, star Al Pacino, and its co-star Andy Garcia. Francis, please tell us the official title and why it is significant to you to make that change.
Well, it's The Godfather Coda, the death of Michael Corleone. I felt that it could be provocative and a refreshing change. Also, I like the idea that coda means that. It means a wrap-up or an illumination of the first two films, and that appealed to me very much.
Andy, you were the new kid on the block. Was there any hesitation on your part to say yes?
You know, no, of course not. The reason why I became an actor was because of The Godfather Part 1, and that movie changed my life. I wanted to desperately be a part of it, like all actors of my generation. That was a very coveted part, to work with Al and to work with Francis. It was such a great privilege, you know.
What made you want to go back and revisit this film? It's been 30 years.
When I went to put a new title on it, I wanted to make the story more clear. I began with the idea that it was going to be the death of Michael Corleone, and I was going to focus on the main plot so that right from the beginning you understand what's going on. He's making a deal with the Vatican. He's doing it so that his children can be once and for all lifted out of the context of being a crime family. And in the course of going through it, I found myself making these decisions differently than I had at first. And literally, by the time it was over, I had done a different beginning. I had done a different ending. I had done a different middle. I had made, maybe 360 picture changes of different types. So in a sense, it was a new illusion.
Can you give us an idea of your reaction, Al?
I experienced what indeed it had done for the film to open it the way Francis decides to open it. It centered the film, it focused it, it became a kind of anchor. It really captured the flow.
To me, it's so genuine and so powerful.
It was like a different movie with a different feel, a different style, and a different resolution, and very moving, I must say. It was. We were all the whole group was in tears after seeing it.
When they come, they'll come at what you love.
So I haven't seen this new version of the movie. I'm curious to see how it, things changed with the movie. But I just found it really fascinating that the director Coppola thought, it feels like if you change the beginning, it's really just moving things around, then you'll have a totally different movie. I think the feeling was that the way he originally started, he sort of didn't catch the plot. So if he moves a scene earlier and that starts with that, you'll sort of understand what the movie is about. And it strikes me that that's what the rabbis were concerned about too. They said, where do we begin? Do we begin with our forefathers being idol worshipers, or do we begin with the fact that we were slaves? And that might change the whole meaning of the story. So in typical rabbinic fashion, and this I think is sometimes to the detriment of our text. I mean, I love the Haggadah. I love that it's this composite document, and it's got all these different voices in it. But sometimes what we decide is if there's an argument, we'll just do both. But sometimes you can't do both. I think Coppola would say, well, you can't do that. You got to begin somewhere. But what we do is we have both beginnings. And so you all are probably aware of Avadim Hayinu. You might sing the song at your seders, Avadim Hayinu, Hayinu, Ata b'nei chorin, b'nei chorin. So that's Avadim Hayinu. That's beginning with we were slaves. And that's the story. That's the beginning that Shmuel, although it probably wasn't Shmuel, which we'll see later, is probably a rabbi named Rabba, or Rava, depending on how you pronounce his name. And he says we should begin with we were slaves. And he also says we should say we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there. And then, with the outstretched arm, et cetera, we like to elaborate. But that's essentially what he wants us to start with. Here with later on, after the four children, which we'll talk about probably in the next class, we have the other way of beginning, which was suggested by Rav, which is from the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshipers. And then it includes these verses from Joshua, where Joshua is saying to the people, you're over the river your ancestors dwelled, not in the land of Israel. Then they came, I brought Abraham here. So what is goes on because we like to embellish. So what is the difference then between starting the story at our forefathers were idol worshipers and starting the story with we were slaves? Does it matter? Am I overstating this? What might be the difference in the movie that you were making between those two beginnings? Yeah, Brenda. You're muted.
I was saying if you start when we were idol worshipers, I don't really think we were a people then, to me, because I always thought, we were a people when we started believing in Hashem. But when we were slaves, we were not allowed to practice what we wanted to practice and pray. So to me, that's the story of Passover. And we didn't get the law yet. We didn't get the Torah yet until we actually left Egypt. So I don't know.
So you prefer slaves? You were
question.
slaves.
I prefer slaves, yes.
I have a question, but didn't we not go back to what? You want to interpret the golden calf? Was that?
You cut out there, Phyllis.
During the Exodus?
Can you
The
repeat
golden
it?
calf.
Can you repeat what you said? No, because
Yes, didn't this, as they left, after they left Egypt to freedom, the slaves then went back to having an idol when they were worried about what happened to Moses, and they built the golden calf.
right. So so the idea being that idol worship never left us.
Right.
It remained a problem even after we were freed from Egypt. Yeah, it's a good
Yes,
point.
I mean, I've heard different interpretations what the calf meant, but I don't know how that really interprets into the story.
Right. Yeah, no, so it's a point in favor of idol worship being the disgrace that should begin the Seder. Amanda.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the text actually piggybacks on for what Brenda said, because it very specifically, like the idea that we weren't really a peoples then, because it says our forefathers were idol worshipers, but we were slaves. You know, it's the language is sort of differentiating that those were almost different people than us. It wasn't we were idol worshipers.
Right. So yeah, you're well. So these are you're picking up very specifically on the language that the first is kind of the forefathers were other people, not us. Although I think Rav would say, you know, because I'm beginning this as the disgrace, I'm obviously identifying with our forefathers. But you're right, the identity comes when we say we were slaves.
I also think there's like an ownership aspect of the language like that. Sorry, I feel like I always relate things back to me, but I've talked to other people about like my struggle with, you know, when I was converting and I didn't feel quite as Jewish, I would say, you know, well, they do this at Passover instead of Easter or something like that. And it took me a while. And I think actually at one point, Rabbi, you said like, it's your people. I was like, I'm like, they're doing this. Why? And you're like, your people. So I think there is like a level of taking ownership and commitment to your faith that goes along with that.
Yeah. So which one do you prefer then? We were slaves also?
I have absolutely no preference. Here, I've also never seen the Godfather movies. I have no preference on the language. But I do think, you know, one is in ownership and one is sort of a, ooh, those guys. That's just something to think about.
Right. Well, do you have other, and this is for a question for everyone, you know, is there a situation where you felt that the way that you begin the story matters? I mean, we all have, of course, stories that we tell about ourselves. You know, people say, what's your story? You know, and tell us about yourself. And of course, we could start from anywhere, you know, we could start, well, you know, I loved the Jeffersons as a kid. I don't know if anyone watched it, you know, in the 70s, 80s. I think it started in the 70s, right? But, you know, he always said, my father was a poor sharecropper, Mr. Jefferson, you know, and that was the way he always started the story, and other characters in the show would sort of groan when they heard him start telling his story, because he, you know, he told it all the time, but that was clearly his identity. You know, he had dry cleaners, right? I think he was a dry cleaner king. He started out with nothing. His family had nothing, and he built the dry cleaner empire so he could move on up to the east side, you know, in a deluxe apartment in the sky, you know, like that was his story. And he told it the beginning really mattered, so that he could get up to, to where he was now. So, how we begin that is, I think, really important. So I think this could be also another question to ask at your seders. How do you tell your story? How do you begin, so that you can frame it the way that you want to frame it? Does anybody have an example of like how they tell their story, how you tell your story?
I feel like most people frame the story on what they're proud of, or, you know what I mean? Like when you say, what is your job or what is your past job? I don't say, well, I worked retail for 8 months after college, like while taking college courses. I say, oh, prior to this, I worked here or there. You kind of hide the things on your own personal resume. I feel like people aren't going to say, I was a poor sharecropper and I'm still a poor sharecropper.
You don't think people tell that story, that they, because it's a great story, right? I mean, it goes, even the Talmud, start with at the low point, and so that the high point will be even higher. You don't think people tell? I mean, obviously, if your father was not a sharecropper, then you don't want to lie. But you feel like people will hide that. Yeah, Lynn.
I think that people unfortunately want to up the the person behind them. They want to one better them. So they're going to tell a better story to make them look better. So they're going to go back to, well, that happened to me, but then I turned out to wind up doing this. So they're going to step on the shoulders of the person behind them to make themselves look even better and better. So I definitely think that people go back and say, oh, well, I've got one for you. This is what happened to me. And now look at how wonderful I am today. I think it's nature, unfortunately.
Right. But also, I think it's also part of our nature that the rabbis were doing it here for us as a people, that the story is better if things were bad and now they're good. If it starts out, well, things were great before and now they're great now, it's kind of a boring story, so there's got to be a journey there, and probably most people aren't going to tell their story by saying, my father was rich, and
now he's richer.
Gave me everything I had, and now I'm rich still. That's not the most compelling story. But I see it. I see what you and Amanda are saying there.
Now that you mentioned that, I'm like, all those self-made millionaires, and then you're like, oh, they got a loan from their parents.
Right.
I built this company myself with money that I did not earn.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember there was a big controversy, or I shouldn't say big controversy. I think there was a Forbes profile or something of one of the Kardashian children, the model. I forgot what her name is. And it said, she's the wealthiest self-made woman or something in America. And people said, like, what, self-made is doing a lot there in that sentence. Like, what does that mean that she's self-made? She was born into tremendous wealth and fame and connections, so yes, she didn't necessarily inherit it in the way that we traditionally understand it, but she wasn't, George Jefferson, with the father who was a sharecropper. So, but we like to tell the story of ourselves as being self-made. It's better than just saying, yeah, my parents were able to get me really good connections so I could become a model, and that's how I'm a billionaire now. So I think it's a really interesting question, and we'll talk more. We have to end now, but at our next class, we'll talk a little bit more about these two different ways of beginning, and there might be more behind the text in the history of the Haggadah, than simply just two rabbis thinking about two different places to start the story. So want to thank everyone for joining us. And we have 2 more classes next Tuesday and then the following Tuesday, same time, same bat channel. We'll continue the deep dive into the Haggadah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It was very good, very interesting,
Wonderful.
Thank
Yep.
you.
wonderful.
Have a great night.
It has-
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Debbie.
He said it's such a cold way.
Bye.
Rabbi, can I ask you a weird question that has nothing to do with this?
Sure.